I worked for 10 years to pay off my parents' debt. Now they are taking out another loan without my knowledge for another whim of my golden sister, and I'm Jason, and if you told me 10 years ago that I'd be where I am now, I'd have laughed in your face. But here I am, and it's a long story, one that I wish was just fiction. Growing up, I wasn't the popular kid. Hell, I wasn't even the normal kid. I was the easy target, the one everyone picked on. School was, well, it was brutal. I got shoved into lockers, humiliated in front of classmates, called every name in the book, and got bruises that took way too long to heal. It didn't help that things at home were a mess. My parents, Karen and Rob, were always knee-deep in debt. Money problems were a part of our lives as far back as I can remember. Rob worked odd jobs when he could, but he was a gambler, and money slipped through his fingers faster than we could earn it. Karen always seemed stressed, but looking back, she was also always scheming. Every month there was some new way to get money from somewhere, some loan, some deal, but nothing ever worked out. It was a cycle of getting, losing, and begging, and somehow, I got pulled into that mess from an early age. When I turned 18, I'd had enough. My childhood felt like it had been taken from me. Bullies outside, family chaos at home, and I wanted out. But my family's debts were like chains around my ankles. Every time I got close to leaving, Karen would remind me, "We sacrificed so much for you, Jason. Don't you want to help us just a little longer?" That little longer turned into years. They had a habit of reminding me of everything they supposedly did for me. I'll admit, they kept me fed and clothed, but there was no affection. "No, I'm proud of you, or we'll figure it out together." I was a financial plan, a backup source of income before I was even old enough to understand what debt was. It was as if they were saying, "We're in trouble, so you're in trouble too." And me? I wanted to make something of myself, to live a life that didn't revolve around bills, creditors, and that looming dread of the next missed payment. So I worked. I took every job I could find, dishwashing, warehouse jobs, construction, whatever paid. For a long time, my life was a blur of night shifts, calluses, and exhaustion. But bit by bit, I made progress. I chipped away at their debts, sometimes sending more than half of what I earned to help them. And don't get me wrong, I was okay with that, sort of. I figured it was my way of paying them back for raising me, even if it wasn't exactly a nurturing childhood. But here's where things get interesting. Just as I was about to clear the last of the debt, I found out something that hit me harder than any punch or taunt I'd ever faced. I was at my parents' house one evening, doing my usual accounting for them. They never could manage numbers right, and I stumbled across a statement that didn't add up. My sister, Olivia, who never worked a day in her life and spent most of her time traveling, shopping, and doing God knows what, was getting married. And guess who was paying for it? Surprise, it was me, or at least that's what they planned. Turns out, Karen and Rob had taken out another massive loan without saying a word to me. They were expecting me to pay it back, like all the other debts, only this one wasn't for survival. It was for Olivia's wedding. That's when it hit me. They didn't care. Not about me, not about my sacrifices, not about the fact that I'd put my life on hold for a decade. All they cared about was Olivia, the golden child who could do no wrong. Olivia and I have never been close. She's 3 years younger than me and has always been, well, pampered. When we were kids, I'd be helping out with chores or taking odd jobs to help around the house, while Olivia got dance lessons, new clothes, and anything she wanted. And now, years later, here I was, working my life away, and Olivia was getting a wedding that cost more than I'd ever seen in my bank account. She hadn't contributed a dime. I confronted my parents that night, asking why they thought it was okay to take out a loan without telling me, especially one for something so extravagant. I was met with the same phrases I'd heard my whole life. Karen said, "Jason, family is everything. Olivia deserves this." Rob barely looked at me, just shrugged like it was nothing. It was the kind of indifference that made my stomach turn. Olivia, of course, was unapologetic. She waltzed into the room while I was talking to my parents, and when I asked her how she felt about me working myself to the bone to pay for her fairy tale wedding, she just smirked and said, "Oh, come on, Jason. You know you're good at working hard. It's what you do. And it's not like you have anything else going on." The entitlement in her voice made me want to scream. I'd spent my life putting everyone else first, and here was my sister, telling me that's all I was good for. That night, something in me broke. The idea of giving another dollar, another hour, another bit of my life to people who saw me as nothing more than a bank was unbearable. For so long, I'd put my own dreams on hold. Relationships, passions, a life of my own, all for their sake. And for what? So Olivia could throw some fairy tale wedding while I was still slogging through life? I felt a kind of rage I didn't know I had. I looked at my parents and Olivia, all of them just staring at me, either indifferent or annoyed that I dared to speak up, and I realized something had to change. I told them I was done, that this was the last time I'd bail them out. They just laughed it off, like I was throwing a tantrum. "Jason," Karen said with that fake sympathy, "you'll help us. You always do." I walked out that night and didn't look back. Derek, my best friend since high school, was the one person who really understood what my family had put me through. I called him and told him everything, and he just listened, letting me vent. When I finally finished, he said something that stuck with me. "Jason, you're not their savior. You've got to let them deal with their own mess. Otherwise, they'll never see you as anything but a crutch." And that's when the idea started forming in my head. What if I stopped? What if I really cut them off? Let them face the consequences of their own actions? It felt impossible, terrifying even, but it was the first time I'd ever let myself consider what my life could look like without being the family ATM. For the first time in my life, I started thinking about what I wanted. After that night, something inside me shifted. I didn't go back to my parents' house for days. It was hard. Years of habit and guilt were rooted deep, making it feel like I was betraying them just by keeping my distance. But I needed space, and I needed to think. In those days, I wrestled with 100 questions. Was I wrong to be angry? Had I really sacrificed as much as I felt I had? Or was I just being self-righteous? But no matter how I spun it, one truth kept slapping me in the face. They'd used me, and not just used me, relied on it, expected it, and felt entitled to my sacrifices without a shred of gratitude. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that they didn't care about me, not in the way I'd always hoped. They cared about what I could give them, what I could do for them. And Olivia? She wasn't just spoiled. She'd become a parasite, living off my hard work, looking down on me the whole time. I finally decided to go back and talk to them, though I had no idea what I was going to say. Maybe I hoped they'd apologize, or at least understand my anger. But what happened when I walked in? Olivia was sitting in the living room with my mom, flipping through some wedding magazines like nothing was wrong. She barely looked up at me. Karen glanced at me and sighed, as if I'd interrupted their important bonding time. "Jason," Karen said, with that condescending tone she perfected over the years. "Glad you finally came to your senses." "Came to my senses?" I repeated, feeling my face heat up. "Do you even understand why I'm mad?" Karen exchanged a glance with Olivia before looking back at me. "Jason, we know you're tired, but you know how much Olivia's wedding means to this family. Don't you want your sister to have a day she'll remember forever?" I laughed. Actually laughed. "Are you kidding me? I've been working nonstop for 10 years to cover your debts, and you think I'm going to put myself in more debt so she can have some fancy wedding?" Karen just sighed again, that disappointed mother look on her face. "Jason, we all have responsibilities to family. We've done so much for you, and now it's your turn to do the same for Olivia. What have you done for me?" I asked, voice rising. "You kept me fed and clothed. Sure, but after that? I don't remember a single time you actually supported me. And now, when I'm finally close to being free, you're trying to trap me all over again." That's when Olivia decided to chime in, looking at me with that familiar smirk. "Oh, come on, Jason. It's not like you're going to do anything with the money anyway. All you do is work. This wedding? It's actually something important for once." "Important?" I could barely keep my voice steady. "Olivia, I've been bailing you out your entire life. Do you even realize that?" She just shrugged, brushing off my words like they were dust on her shoulder. "Well, that's what family does, Jason. You help each other. And don't act like you're the only one making sacrifices. I've had to give up plenty for this wedding." "Like what?" I shot back, feeling my patience snap. "Well, she huffed, crossing her arms. I had to change the date to accommodate the venue schedule. I wanted it in June, but now it's going to be in August. And I had to cut down my guest list. Do you know how hard that is? Her words hit me like a slap. She was listing her sacrifices, like I was supposed to be moved by her struggles to accommodate the wedding of her dreams. She was truly oblivious, completely disconnected from reality. I turned to Karen. You really think this is fair? You really think it's okay to put me in debt just so Olivia can have her little fairy tale wedding? Karen's eyes narrowed, her voice dripping with that usual manipulative sweetness. Jason, life isn't fair. But we're family. You have to help us, especially your sister. She deserves a beautiful wedding, and this will be good for everyone. You'll be proud to see her happy. At that moment, I realized there was no point in talking. They weren't going to understand because they didn't want to. They had their golden child, and I was just the workhorse, the one they expected to carry the burden while they lived their lives in blissful ignorance. I left that night, more determined than ever to put an end to this madness. But as angry as I was, I didn't know where to start. Breaking away from my family felt like cutting off my own arm. I'd spent so much time defining myself by their needs and demands that I didn't know who I'd be without them. That's when I decided to call Derek again. He'd always been the one person who could talk some sense into me, and I needed that grounding voice. I told him everything, sparing none of the ridiculous details about Olivia's sacrifices and Karen's manipulation. By the time I finished, Derek was practically laughing, more in disbelief than humor. Man, he said, finally catching his breath. I don't know how you've put up with them for this long. I don't either, I admitted, feeling a strange sense of relief just saying it out loud. Jason, listen, Derek said, his tone serious now. This isn't just about money. It's about respect. They don't respect you. They never have. And as long as you keep giving, they'll keep taking. They don't care about what it costs you. So unless you want this to be the rest of your life, you've got to put your foot down. He was right. Deep down, I knew that. But there was still that nagging guilt, that sense of responsibility that had been drilled into me since childhood. I'd spent my whole life believing that family meant putting yourself last, that loyalty meant sacrifice. But now I was starting to wonder if loyalty went both ways, or if I'd just been fooling myself. After my talk with Derek, I knew what I had to do. I went back to my tiny apartment, grabbed a pen and a piece of paper, and wrote a letter to Karen and Rob. I told them, in plain and simple words, that I was done. I wasn't going to pay for Olivia's wedding, and I wasn't going to pay off any more debts they took out. From now on, they were on their own. It took everything I had to walk over to their house and leave that letter on the kitchen table. I knew they'd hate me for it, that they'd probably see it as the ultimate betrayal. But it was the first step toward taking back my life, and I was willing to take whatever backlash came with it. The days that followed were tense. I waited, expecting a barrage of angry calls, or even a visit, but nothing came. I started to think maybe, just maybe, they'd gotten the message. Then, a few nights later, my phone buzzed. It was Karen. I almost didn't answer, but part of me was curious. Maybe she'd finally understood. Maybe she'd be willing to talk this through, adult to adult. But no. The minute I picked up, her voice was laced with venom. Jason, how could you do this to us? How could you abandon your family like this? The accusations came hard and fast. I was selfish. I was cruel. I was throwing my family to the wolves. I tried to stay calm, to explain that I just couldn't keep sacrificing my life for their choices, but she wouldn't hear it. All she cared about was how I'd left them with no safety net, with no backup plan. And that's when I finally saw it. She really believed I was nothing more than their safety net. To her, I wasn't a son, not in the way a mother should see her child. I was a tool, a resource to be used, and she was furious that I dared to take that away. I hung up, heart pounding, hands shaking. I'd thought there might be a shred of decency, some part of her that would see what they'd done to me. But there was nothing, just anger, disappointment, and entitlement. The whole time, all I could think was, asterisk, I can't go back. Not this time, asterisk. After that call with Karen, I knew things were about to get ugly. She wasn't one to back down, and if there was one thing I'd learned, It was that my mother had a way of manipulating situations to make me feel guilty. But this time, I didn't feel guilty. I felt free, in a way I hadn't before. The next day, my phone buzzed with messages. They started as pleas. Jason, we need you. You're all we have. Please don't do this to us. Then, when I didn't respond, they turned into guilt-tripping. We raised you, sacrificed everything for you. Is this how you repay us? And finally, the messages took on a nasty edge. If you're abandoning us, then don't expect to be welcome back. You're no son of ours. Each message felt like a slap, but Derek's words kept echoing in my mind. They don't respect you. They never have. And each message only made that clearer. I was nothing more than a lifeline to them. A lifeline they thought they could yank at will. It was exhausting to get message after message, all demanding I come crawling back. So I turned off my phone for a few days and tried to distract myself. I took on extra shifts, went out with friends, and started seeing Sophia, a girl I'd met a few months back. She was one of the few people I felt comfortable enough to confide in, though I kept the details vague at first. There was something grounding about Sophia's presence. She had this calm, understanding way about her, and I was drawn to her kindness like a lifeline. Over dinner one night, I finally told her a bit about my family, how they kept me wrapped up in their financial mess for years, using me like a human piggy bank. She listened intently, nodding in all the right places, never interrupting. When I finished, she just shook her head. Jason, I don't even have words. But I'm glad you stood up for yourself. Sometimes family can be the hardest to walk away from, even when it's the healthiest thing to do. I felt this sense of validation in her words, a warmth that went beyond sympathy. She didn't try to solve my problems or tell me what to do. She just listened, understood, and supported me. It was the first time I'd felt like someone truly cared about me without expecting anything in return. But of course, my peace was short-lived. A few days after my talk with Sophia, I got a knock on my door. Opening it, I found Rob standing there, looking grayer and wearier than I'd ever seen him. I hadn't heard from him directly since the whole wedding loan mess began. He was always the quieter of my parents, letting Karen handle the drama. But seeing him there, hands shoved in his pockets, shifting uncomfortably, I knew something was up. Can we talk, Jason? He asked, his voice softer than I remembered. I let him in, offering him a seat at my small, cramped table. Rob looked around my modest apartment, a far cry from the image of financial stability they assumed I had. There were boxes in the corner, unpacked from my last move, a couch that had definitely seen better days. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and I'd worked hard for it. He cleared his throat, looking anywhere but at me. Look, your mother. She might have gone too far with the wedding loan, but you have to understand. She just wants the best for Olivia. I scoffed. The best for Olivia, or the best for herself? Rob winced. We thought you'd be okay with helping. You've always been there for us, you know? And that's the problem, Rob, I said, feeling my frustration rise. You never ask if I'm okay. You just assume I'll keep putting my life on hold so you can live yours. He nodded slowly, but I could see that he wasn't really absorbing my words. There was a long silence before he looked up at me, eyes pleading. Jason, we're in deep this time. If you don't help us, we could lose everything. I felt a strange sense of detachment as he spoke. This was a line I'd heard before, 1,000 times. The crisis was always just around the corner, and it was always my responsibility to fix it. Rob, I said carefully, you're asking me to ruin my life so you and Mom can keep doing what you've always done. I've sacrificed years for you. I'm done. For the first time, he seemed to register the finality in my voice. His face fell, and I saw a flicker of anger beneath his disappointment. I see, he said coldly, standing up. If that's how you feel, then don't expect any of us to be there when you need family. I watched him leave, a strange calm settling over me. It was the kind of calm you feel when a storm has passed, leaving behind destruction but also a clear, open sky. I knew I'd done the right thing, even if my parents would never see it that way. The next few weeks were tense. I knew they'd been counting on me, and now that I was out of the picture, The weight of that loan would be crashing down on them hard. Karen and Rob had spent years ignoring the reality of their finances, but now reality was coming for them, and I wasn't going to stand in its way. It wasn't long before I started hearing through the grapevine, mainly through some of our mutual acquaintances, that things were falling apart for my parents. Karen had apparently made some deal with the bank that hinged on family support, a deal that was now unraveling because, well, I was no longer playing along. Their house was at risk, their credit tanked, and Olivia's wedding plans were falling to pieces. From what I heard, they'd had to cancel the extravagant venue and settle for something much smaller, something they could barely afford without my help. I won't lie, part of me felt guilty. Even though I knew it wasn't my fault, that years of bad decisions had finally caught up with them. A small voice in the back of my mind kept nagging, whispering that I could make things easier for them if I just caved in one more time. But that voice was quieter now, more manageable. Every time it rose up, I reminded myself of what Derek and Sophia had said, of all the years I'd already given up. I couldn't go back, not this time. Then, one night, I got a call from Olivia. I debated not answering, but curiosity got the better of me. She wasted no time, launching into a tirade the second I picked up. "You ruined everything," she shrieked, voice full of venom. "Do you know what you've done to Mom and Dad? To me? You're the reason our family is falling apart." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Olivia, this is the result of years of their choices. I'm not going to keep fixing everything for them, and especially not for you. You think you're so noble, don't you?" she spat. "Working your dead-end jobs, acting like you're some kind of martyr. Newsflash, Jason, nobody cares. You're just a loser who'd rather let his family suffer than help them." I felt something snap inside me. I'd taken so much from her, from them, but this was too much. "You know what, Olivia?" I said, my voice ice cold. "You're right. I am a loser, if that's what you want to believe. But at least I've earned everything I have. I haven't lived off someone else's hard work, expecting everything to be handed to me. I'm done sacrificing for people who don't give a damn about me." There was silence on the other end, and for a moment, I thought she'd hung up. But then, in a quieter voice, Olivia said, "You'll regret this, Jason. One day, you'll realize what you've lost." And then she was gone, leaving me standing there, feeling like I'd finally crossed a line that could never be undone. In the days that followed, I heard even more rumors. Olivia's wedding had been reduced to a small courthouse ceremony, and Karen and Rob were scrambling, trying to find anyone who'd help them. But no one was willing to bail them out this time. The bank had given them a deadline, and the clock was ticking. Sophia became my refuge during that time. Whenever the guilt threatened to consume me, she was there, reminding me of why I'd made this choice in the first place. We spent more time together, our bond deepening in a way that felt so different from anything I'd experienced with my family. With her, I felt valued, appreciated, like I was finally seen as a person, not just a resource. One evening, as we were sitting on her porch, watching the stars, she turned to me and asked, "Do you regret it? Cutting them off?" I thought about it for a moment, then shook my head. "No. I mean, it's hard. They were my whole world for so long. But I finally feel like I can breathe. Like I'm free." Sophia smiled, resting her head on my shoulder. "Good. You deserve to be happy, Jason. You deserve to live your own life." And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I believed her. The days that followed were surprisingly quiet. Karen and Rob seemed to have finally realized that I wasn't coming back to save them. Olivia's calls and texts dried up, too, and my life settled into a peaceful rhythm. I was finally able to focus on myself, my work, my own interests, my relationship with Sophia. Every now and then, that old guilt would rise up like a phantom pain. But I'd remind myself of what Derek, Sophia, and even my own instincts had been telling me. It was okay to choose myself for once. For a few months, I almost managed to forget about the chaos I'd left behind. I got a promotion at work, moved into a better apartment, and even started considering going back to school. Sophia encouraged me to look into programs, helped me pick out courses, and slowly I started envisioning a life that didn't include me constantly putting out fires for other people. One evening, I came home to find a letter in my mailbox. It was from Karen and Rob's bank. At first, I thought it was a mistake. They'd never sent me anything directly before. But when I opened it, I realized why. The letter was a formal notification that my parents' house was now in foreclosure. They were months behind on payments and had exhausted all extensions. Part of me wanted to tear up the letter and throw it away, but curiosity got the better of me. I called Derek and told him about it, and he listened, quiet as always, until I'd gotten it all out. "So," he said after a long pause, "what are you thinking?" I laughed, feeling a hollow ache in my chest. "Honestly, I don't know. Part of me wants to step in and fix it, like old times, you know? Just make the problem go away so I don't have to think about it." Derek sighed. "Jason, you've spent years bailing them out. Maybe it's time they face the music. You're not doing anyone any favors by putting yourself in debt again." He was right, but I still felt conflicted. As much as I'd wanted to walk away, this was still my family. The thought of them losing their house, of Karen and Rob struggling to find a place to live, tore at me. But I couldn't deny that they'd done this to themselves. I wasn't responsible for the loans they'd taken or the lifestyle they'd chosen to maintain. No amount of guilt was going to change that. That weekend, I decided to drive by their house. I didn't intend to go inside or talk to them. I just wanted to see it one last time, to remind myself why I'd chosen to leave it all behind. When I pulled up, the house looked eerily quiet. The yard was overgrown, the paint was peeling, and there were foreclosure notices taped to the front door. It felt strange, seeing the place I'd grown up in reduced to this state. It was like looking at a reflection of everything that had gone wrong in my life. As I sat there, I thought back to all the years I'd spent here, all the sacrifices I'd made, and suddenly, I felt relief. Seeing the house in this condition, knowing it wasn't my responsibility anymore, lifted a weight I didn't realize I'd still been carrying. I didn't need to go inside. I didn't need to look back. A few weeks later, I got a call from Karen. I hesitated before picking up, half expecting another guilt trip or sob story. But when I answered, I was met with silence, followed by a quiet "Jason, we're being evicted." It was a strange feeling, hearing those words. I could sense her desperation, the weight of everything they'd ignored for years finally crashing down. And yet, I felt strangely calm, detached even. I took a deep breath, waiting to see if she'd say more, but she didn't. "What do you want me to do about it?" I asked, my voice level. I could almost feel her surprise through the phone. She was so used to me bending over backward to help that my refusal must have seemed unthinkable. "We have nowhere to go," she whispered. "Everything's falling apart, Jason. We made mistakes, but we're still family." Her words cut deep, but I stayed firm. "Karen, I gave you everything I had. I can't keep sacrificing my life for mistakes you chose to make. I warned you this would happen. I told you I couldn't keep doing this." There was a long silence, and for a moment, I thought she might understand. But then she said, "Jason, please. You don't want your parents out on the streets, do you?" And that was it. The same manipulation, the same expectation that I would come running because they had nothing left. I felt a cold anger rise in me, and I spoke before I could stop myself. "Maybe it's time you both figured out what it's like to live without relying on me. I'm done, Karen. You're going to have to find another way." I hung up, my hands shaking, but I didn't feel guilty this time. I felt free. Days passed, and I tried to settle back into my life, focusing on work, spending time with Sophia, and letting myself dream of a future that didn't involve cleaning up my family's messes. Sophia could see the shift in me, the lightness I felt after finally putting my foot down. One night, over dinner, she looked at me and smiled. "You seem happier, Jason. Lighter somehow." I laughed, surprised by her observation. "I think I am. For the first time, I'm living for myself. It's weird, but in a good way." She reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. "You deserve it. You've spent too long carrying burdens that weren't yours to bear." As the months passed, I heard bits and pieces about my family's situation. Karen and Rob ended up moving into a small apartment on the edge of town, and Olivia had to scale back her life significantly. The wedding had been a small courthouse affair, nothing like the grand celebration she'd planned. In a strange way, it felt like karma had finally caught up with them, forcing them to confront the consequences of their choices. Every now and then, I'd get a call from Karen or Rob, always with the same underlying message. They needed help, they needed money, they needed me. But I didn't pick up. I let the calls go to voicemail, the messages piling up like echoes of the past, a past I was no longer part of. My life with Sophia grew richer, deeper. We started talking about our future, about what we wanted, and what we were willing to do to make it happen. For the first time, I could see myself building something meaningful, something that was mine. I wasn't Jason, the family crutch, the bailout, the fixer. I was just Jason, a man with his own dreams and ambitions. Then one evening, as Sophia and I were making dinner, she looked at me and said, "I want you to meet my parents." I froze, the idea of meeting her family both exciting and terrifying. I'd spent so much time dealing with my own family's mess that I hadn't even considered the idea of meeting someone else's. But Sophia's family wasn't like mine. They were kind, supportive, and, as Sophia described them, a little nosy but in a good way. The night we met her parents was surreal. Her father, Tom, was warm and welcoming, full of jokes and stories, while her mother, Joan, fussed over us, insisting we eat more, asking me about my work, my goals. It was a world away from what I'd grown up with. They genuinely cared, genuinely listened, and I found myself opening up in a way I never had before. As we drove home that night, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for everything I'd missed. I'd spent years thinking that family had to mean sacrifice, pain, and guilt, but here was this whole new version of family, one that was about support, love, and acceptance. For the first time, I began to see that maybe I could have a future where family didn't mean constant sacrifice. A few days later, I got a final message from Karen. It was short, almost resigned. "Jason, we don't know how to fix this, but I hope you're happy. I hope you find the life you deserve." I read those words over and over, trying to parse out her meaning. Part of me wanted to believe it was genuine, that maybe Karen was finally accepting that I couldn't keep giving up my life for theirs. But another part of me knew that she'd probably exhausted every option and simply had no other choice. In the end, it didn't matter. I had my own life now, and for the first time, I was okay with leaving the past behind. Sophia and I started planning for the future in earnest. We talked about getting a place together, maybe starting a family someday, building a life that was built on love, trust, and mutual respect. And as we talked, I realized that I was finally, truly free. Free from the weight of my parents' debts, from the expectations they'd placed on me, from the guilt that had kept me tethered to a life that wasn't mine. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was living, not just surviving. And that was a freedom worth everything I'd given up.